The path from college hopeful to commissioned officer was a compressed, unforgiving crucible. It was designed by a desperate army. George D. Wilson's athletic conditioning served him well. He endured basic training at Camp Wheeler, but the true test came at Officer Candidate School. The program at Fort Benning was not merely academic, it was a psychological and physical gauntlet. The goal was not to teach tactics. The goal was to strip away the civilian and reveal the leader. 78 men signed up for the rigorous selection process. Only 17 survived the intense weeding out. They earned the moniker 90-Day Wonders. The pressure was constant, driven by the knowledge that every man who failed meant another officer shortage on a distant front. When he received his commission as a second lieutenant on May 8, 1943, the date marked less a celebration. It was a formal decree of his readiness for war. After months of experimental training and maneuvers, the order for deployment arrived in the spring of 1944. The journey began at Camp Shanks, New York. It was followed by a long, anxious voyage across the Atlantic. Aboard the cramped Canadian landing craft Infantry, packed into a convoy of 100 ships, the men existed in perpetual, vibrating tension. The constant, high-pitched whine of submarine alerts cut through the monotony of the ocean. That sound, mixed with the smell of diesel, kept nerves raw and sleep sporadic. Arriving in Liverpool on April 20th, the lieutenant and his cohort were shifted to Camp Warminster. The anticipation built into a palpable heavy weight. They were close enough to hear the rumours. They knew the world was about to change. When the D-Day landings finally commenced on June 6, 1944, the officers knew their time was measured in days. Near the end of June, the landing craft infantry brought them to the coast of Normandy. The landing was chaos, a transition from the rolling sea to the sudden, tactile reality of war. Disembarking into the freezing water, the lieutenant was instantly immersed in the overwhelming logistics of the invasion. The beaches were not heroic landscapes. They were muddy, pulverized staging grounds. They were thick with the acrid smell of burnt metal and the omnipresent stench of uncollected death. Vehicles, ordnance, and men moved in a ceaseless, terrifying procession inland. The need for replacements was so critical that the lieutenant was not given time to acclimatize. He was assigned to the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. He found himself in a replacement center near Saint-Omer-Église. He waited in an apple orchard, sleeping in a pup tent just a few miles from the front. His initiation into combat was tragically preceded by the massive bombing error of July 21, 1944. This error was intended to herald the St. Louis breakthrough. The resulting friendly fire disaster saw thousands of bombers drop their payloads onto their own lines. It was a staggering introduction to the fallibility of war. The ground was churned into a lunar landscape of craters large enough to swallow a jeep. The air was heavy with the pervasive, sweet, sickening smell of death that lingered long after the smoke cleared. The next day, July 26th, the lieutenant went into action. He was sent to E Company, where he met Lieutenant Pizaruk. He was immediately placed under the guidance of D-Day veterans like Sergeant Chick Reed and Otha Anders. But no amount of experienced mentorship could prepare him for the grim reality laid out by Colonel Buck Lanham. Lanham's briefing was brief, brutal, and devoid of platitudes. He warned them that casualties would be astronomical.
He demanded that officers lead from the front,
setting a stark, impossible standard for survival. The first kill was not a tactical victory, it was a profound psychological rupture. The instant the enemy soldier fell, the theoretical training received at Fort Benning evaporated. It left behind a terrifying void. The lieutenant realized that the army had trained him to fire, but not to cope with the aftermath of what he had done. To survive, he was forced to immediately construct a psychological defense mechanism. He walled off the trauma to concentrate solely on the immediate, desperate tasks of survival. This was a stark contrast to the clean, predictable scenarios rehearsed in Georgia. This immediate chaos was amplified by the constant danger of friendly fire. Early in the Santolo engagement, confusion led to a terrifying incident. A 105mm artillery barrage mistakenly zeroed in on their own positions. The shrieking approach of the shells, aimed at their coordinates, instilled a sense of betrayal and helplessness. It highlighted the terrifying fragility of established communication systems. Death could arrive just as easily from their own lines as from the German 88s. The lessons learned in those first hours were harsh. Improvisation superseded doctrine. Survival depended less on formal command structures than on sheer, desperate initiative. The gap between training and battlefield reality was not a chasm, it was an abyss. The St. Lo breakthrough, paid for in the blood and shock of the initial assaults, was formally completed on August 2nd, 1944. It was the strategic release valve the Allied command desperately needed. The infantry's brutal yard-by-yard fight through the hedgerows created the critical opening. This allowed General Patton's motorized Third Army to pour through and begin the devastating pursuit across France. The momentum of the entire war had shifted, but the advance for the foot soldiers remained a relentless, high-cost ordeal. The most devastating lesson in the fragility of life came during what became known as the Massacre of Villebourdon Ridge. A routine assignment turned into a catastrophe when the company found itself exposed. They were trapped in a tactical shooting gallery. 9 out of 17 Sherman tanks were instantly incinerated. The carnage was a combination of German tactical genius and a heartbreaking friendly fire incident. The formidable 88mm artillery was positioned for maximum effect. The friendly fire was triggered by a misfired signal. Under the terrifying, eerie glare of enemy fire, thought and speech became impossible. The men were reduced to a state of naked, visceral helplessness as the shells rained down. This underscored the chaotic nature of the conflict, where death could arrive from any direction at any moment. The company was reduced to 27 men. Despite these harrowing losses, the advance could not stop. The strategic payoff for the infantry's sacrifice was soon realized in the Falaise Gap at the end. The coordination of Allied air power and ground forces led to the near annihilation of 2 German armies. The landscape became a graveyard of German ambition. It was littered with the hulks of hundreds of burned-out vehicles. This provided dramatic proof of the Allied aerial dominance. The next major obstacle was the swift, broad current of the Seine River. German anti-aircraft artillery made crossing perilous. The delay was ultimately solved, not by military engineering, but by civilian ingenuity. A retired French naval captain, observing the struggles, devised an ingenious, unconventional plan. He managed to slow the river's flow just enough to allow for the construction of a pontoon bridge. This small, unheralded act allowed the pursuit to continue. It was a testament to how local knowledge often superseded rigid military doctrine. The relentless pace of the advance culminated in the triumphant liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944. The American troops were met by joyous chaos. The Champs-Élysées was a solid wall of humanity, shouting and cheering in ecstatic relief. Yet, for the infantry, the celebration was a fleeting, almost surreal interlude. They were instantly ordered back to the pursuit. They plunged into a rapid, often uncoordinated advance that covered 50 to 60 miles a day. This pursuit was fraught with complex moral ambiguities and hidden dangers. Civilians, desperate for freedom, tossed flowers and gifts. But the men had to remain vigilant. Soldiers who wandered off for wine and women risked encountering desperate enemy patrols. The most insidious threat was the minefield. The Germans employed delaying tactics, seeding roads and fields with death. The Bouncing Betty, an anti-personnel mine, became the infantryman's nightmare. And tripped, it launched into the air before exploding. It scattered ball bearings like a shotgun, killing indiscriminately within 40 yards. The constant gnawing fear of stepping on one of these devices instilled a deep psychological strain. This contrasted sharply with the romanticized narrative of liberation. The author and his men, the ordinary infantry units, pushed the German forces to the breaking point. Their sustained efforts were often overlooked in favor of celebrated generals. They captured a German anti-tank gun crew. Their scouts displayed remarkable individual initiative, but the brutal, constant movement took its toll. The relentless pursuit ended abruptly at the gates of Germany. On September 12, 1944, the 22nd Infantry Regiment became the first American unit to penetrate German soil. Facing them was the formidable concrete reality of the Siegfried Line. Colonel Lanham viewed the defensive system not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a fixed target. He spearheaded the planning. The line, with its overlapping fields of fire and thick cement pillboxes, signaled a return to entrenched, deliberate combat. The initial penetration, led by Lieutenant Colonel Teague's 3rd Battalion, was a tactical success. Yet the potential for this breakthrough to shorten the war was tragically undermined almost immediately. The tank infantry team, advancing toward a crossroads west of Hontium, was utterly wiped out in less than 5 minutes. The cause was a catastrophic German artillery barrage. It featured the terrifying Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, or screaming memes. The shrieking multi-barreled rockets turned the exposed ground into a slaughterhouse. This sudden halt was not due to German tactical superiority, it was due to critical failures in strategic support. Eisenhower's pencil-like thrusts policy, combined with a crippling shortage of ammunition and gas, prevented the exploitation of the initial breach. The troops, who had fought through hell to achieve a decisive breakthrough, were forced to spend over a week in defensive positions. They experienced the bizarre luxury of hot food for the first time in over a month. This was a stark indictment of the logistical priorities that had starved the front lines. Amidst this strategic tragedy, individual acts of courage shone through. During one engagement, a young, unnamed lieutenant walked directly into the kill zone. He induced a dozen or more German soldiers to surrender. They was described only as a little nut for his persistent, almost reckless efforts. He was killed shortly thereafter. When his body was recovered, his jacket pockets were crammed with German money, pocket watches, and photos of German soldiers and their families. This was a poignant, tragic reminder of the shared, fragile humanity that existed on both sides. The opportunity for a decisive, war-shortening victory had been missed. The war would now continue for 6 months longer than it might have. It would cost untold thousands of lives due to the failure to sustain the advance. The Hürtgen Forest, a 100-square-mile expanse of dense ancient woodland, was a special hell for the American infantry. It was a strategically questionable campaign, fought not because it was a key objective, but out of fear. The Allied High Command feared that the Germans would utilize the raw river dams to flood the plains below. Furthermore, the forest was perceived as a necessary hurdle to clear before reaching the flat, open ground of the Cologne plains. The decision to fight through this rugged roller coaster terrain, rather than bypass it, proved catastrophic. The Germans held every advantage. Their defenses were based on an intimate, generations-long knowledge of the land. They were reinforced by deep, well-camouflaged bunkers made of thick logs and earth. These bunkers were impervious to standard artillery. The terrain itself made movement slow, visibility zero, and communication nearly impossible. Winter arrived with dreary rain, snow, and a miserable chill. It turned the forest floor into a slick, adhesive mud that swallowed jeeps and men alike. The most terrifying innovation of the Hürtgen was the tree burst. Artillery shells, fused to explode upon striking the high canopy, rained lethal shrapnel downwards. It felt like a continuous metallic storm. Traditional foxholes were useless against this horizontal deluge of steel. They offered cover from ground-level fire, but not from above. Casualties mounted at a staggering pace, transforming the forest into a meat grinder. The constant rotation of officers and non-commissioned officers, killed or wounded, left units perpetually unstable. The author, amidst this chaos, was suddenly thrust into command of F Company, 22nd Infantry. Despite his deep experience and resilience, he felt profoundly inadequate. Yet the attrition rate left no room for doubt. His promotion was a necessity born of the carnage, a personal turning point within the larger, horrifying narrative of human loss. The physical environment actively conspired against the American effort. The narrow, muddy jeep trails were often mined and booby-trapped. They severely hampered supply lines. Ammunition, hot food, and the evacuation of the wounded became agonizing, arduous tasks. This impacted troop effectiveness and crushed morale. The psychological toll was equally severe. The constant pressure of combat fractured men in unexpected ways. A critical moment of truth arrived, with the discovery that 2 radio men were faking battle fatigue. One, a former ham radio operator, displayed extreme theatrical distress. He was sobbing and pleading to be sent to the rear. Lieutenant Wilson refused to indulge the manipulation. He recalled the stark contrast between the icy misery of the front and the comfort of the rear echelon hospitals. He used the language of football, the only common ground he could find, to demand duty. He was challenging the simplistic notion that soldiers were merely automatons following orders. This confrontation underscored the complex psychological landscape of the war. Genuine breakdown and the desperate manipulation of it existed side by side. The relentless pressure culminated in the fight for Grosshau, a strategically vital town. Before the assault, Wilson demonstrated crucial tactical insight. Colonel Keenan, the battalion commander, proposed a plan to spread F Company thinly across the front. Wilson challenged the order directly. He argued that scattering their strength would invite annihilation. He suggested instead a concentrated punch, using a column of platoons to quickly breach the initial German resistance. Keenan, recognizing the sound logic, accepted the adaptation. The infiltration into Grossau itself was achieved under the cover of darkness. It was surprisingly easy due to an unexpected gap in German defences on the south flank. The men moved cautiously, feeling a brief, fragile sense of relief. That relief was instantly shattered the next morning. The new objective required F Company to advance across approximately 800 yards of open, ploughed field. As they prepared, a marching column of about 500 Germans was spotted moving into position on a ridge ahead. Lieutenant Caldwell, the forward observer, frantically requested artillery support to fire on the column. The request was denied. Colonel Keenan, relying rigidly on a map that was demonstrably incorrect, insisted the ridge was occupied by the American 5th Armored Infantry. Wilson's heated protests were dismissed. They were fueled by the undeniable visual intelligence of longcoats and shovels. The command's rigid adherence to flawed, map-based intelligence proved catastrophic. When the attack commenced, the unmolested German column unleashed an overwhelming barrage of artillery, mortars and machine gun fire. The soft, open slope instantly became a killing field. The narrator described the moment simply: the sky fell in. F Company, which had started with roughly 140 men, lost approximately 90 riflemen in the initial assault alone. The relentless mortar fire, landing perhaps 100 shells in a 50-foot square, turned the advance into a bloody scythe. Wilson found himself in a shell hole with his radio man, enduring the relentless concussions. He felt himself on the black edges of his breaking point. The toughest moment was hearing the stricken men crying out for medics who were no longer there. The medics had been wiped out while working in the open. The catastrophic losses led to the death of Lieutenant Pisarak and the severe wounding of Captain Tolles. This caused G Company to collapse and left F Company fighting alone from noon onward. The forest swallowed the men whole. F Company was decimated, losing 138 out of 150 men. The territory gained was extremely costly yardage, possibly the most expensive real estate in the world. The Hürtgen Forest campaign, which cost the 22nd Infantry Regiment 3,000 men, resulted in the most severe American losses of any European battle. Yet it yielded minimal strategic gain. The survivors emerged, played out, and emotionally spent. They were deeply disillusioned with a higher command whose incompetence had led to such pointless, devastating slaughter. Their rigid faith in flawed maps over frontline intelligence had cost them dearly. They had paid a terrible price for that damned patch of woods. Emerging from the Hürtgen Forest, the survivors of the 22nd Infantry were physically and emotionally spent. They had endured 18 days of an awful beating for minimal gain. The regiment had suffered 3,000 casualties. F Company alone had lost 167% of its enlisted men. The exhausted unit, still unshaven and dirty, was pulled out on December 4th. They were expecting the promised rest and recuperation. Instead, they were immediately trucked to Luxembourg. They were thrown straight into the opening chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive, launched on December 17, 1944, was Hitler's desperate gamble. It exploited a perilously thin Allied defensive line. The author's unit was thrown back into the fight that same afternoon. They formed the bottom hinge of the 75-mile gap the Germans had torn open. The struggle was defined not just by the enemy, but by the cold. That 5 days and nights leading up to Christmas Eve, the men endured temperatures dropping to 10 below zero. This misery was amplified by the military's severe underestimation of winter warfare. The lack of adequate gear was a slow death sentence. Soldiers wore only wool finger gloves and 4-buckle overshoes over their standard leather shoes. Critically, they had only a single pair of cotton socks. Their feet, constantly cold and damp inside tight boots, were susceptible to trench foot. This debilitating condition often led to tissue decay and amputation. Their only respite from the bitter chill in their foxholes was the tricky, often smoky business of burning K-ration cartons. The dazzling white snow, initially beautiful, quickly became a vicious enemy. It hindered movement and intensified the misery. The psychological pressure mounted. The company commander and Lieutenant Lloyd spent hours hunched over maps. They meticulously identified target areas for the artillery. They knew their survival depended on the precision of the supporting fire. The Germans deployed the dreaded six-barreled rockets, the screaming Mimis. Their piercing, eerie screech caused havoc and instilled visceral terror. The company also witnessed a devastating friendly fire incident. Napalm bombs, intended for German positions, engulfed American tanks. This caused quick suffocation. It was a moment of horror marked by bright orange flames and heavy black smoke. The cold was so intense that the author resorted to building a small fire on the floor of a moving jeep just to warm his icy feet. On Christmas Eve, the Army's crippling losses in the Bulge became starkly evident. 100 new replacements arrived, along with 3 new officers. These men were terrifyingly unprepared. They had received only 2 weeks of basic training. This influx of green troops forced the battle-hardened survivors to shift immediately. They went from seeking recuperation to providing intensive, survival-focused training. They knew that the inexperience of the new men could be fatal to the entire company. The training proved necessary almost immediately. F Company faced a significant German assault. A full battalion with double-tank support emerged from the Rodenhof Valley. The company commander called down a massive counter-barrage. Utilizing 155mm long toms, hundreds of shells screamed over their heads. They delivered what the author called a dose of Hürtgen hell to the attackers. The sound of the incoming artillery was sweet music. It saved F Company from being overrun. Once the front stabilized, the author was offered a brief rest and recuperation pass to Paris. The journey was intended as a reward. The experience, however, was one of profound isolation, and GIs celebrated with unrestrained, drunken jubilation. The author felt like an interloper. He was unable to speak the language or connect with the post-war atmosphere that found the city war-weary and impersonal. The psychological distance between the front line and the rear echelon became unbearable at the officers' club. His battle-worn uniform clashed violently with the crisp pinks worn by officers who had never heard a shot fired in anger. This disconnect fostered resentment toward those seemingly detached from the brutal realities of combat. The narrative of the war soon shifted. The unit was transferred to General Patton's Third Army. This brought with it a renewed, if grudging, emphasis on discipline and logistics. They were thrown into the Schwarzen during the dead of winter. The roads were solid with ice and movement was treacherous. The physical devastation of the fighting was visible everywhere, particularly at the strategic crossroads of Bastogne. The city was a ruin of skeletal sidewalls and gutted buildings. The stench of destruction lingered heavily. Nearby St. Vith was a nightmarish, surrealistic painting. A naked mannequin stood amidst the debris, a ghoulish symbol of absurdity. Throughout this final push, the author observed a critical flaw in the Army's command structure. The promotion system prioritized rank over combat qualification. Experienced, effective officers like Captain Arthur Newcomb, a D-Day veteran and the narrator's best friend, were continually overlooked. Less qualified rear echelon personnel advanced quickly. This systemic failure devalued the very experience that was essential for survival. It fostered deep unhappiness among the men who bore the true burden of the fight. The infantry was tasked with the most arduous jobs. This included the all-night effort to dig trenches into the ice on a steep hill. This was done to enable tanks to ascend under the constant threat of Nebelwerfer shells. The final tactical assignments were brutally efficient. Siegfried Line pillboxes were reduced with grenades, flamethrowers and bulldozers. The climax of this period was the daylight assault on Hill 5503. After a failed night attack, the infantry was ordered to retake the high ground in broad daylight. Thawing ground limited heavy tanks and tank destroyers to the road. The infantry advanced across the open slopes under the terrifying coordinated cover of direct overhead fire from the armor. The planning was meticulous. It focused on the precise timing of lifting the barrage to avoid friendly fire. The immense, accurate fire terrorized the entrenched Germans in their log bunkers. This allowed the advancing men to reach the summit with minimal return fire. It proved once again that even the most formidable fortifications could be overcome through coordinated, audacious action. The author's journey, however, was nearing its end. On February 8, 1945, while advancing on the road to Obermellen, the war found him in a moment of deceptive calm. A shell whistled, a sound he knew too well. It was followed by a blast that felt as if it split his head. It left his foot numb from a sledgehammer blow. While lying stunned at the aid station, Lieutenant Lee Lloyd delivered the devastating news. Captain Arthur O. Newcomb had been killed in the same shelling. Newcomb, usually so cautious and battle-wise, had seemingly made no effort to protect himself. The narrator, weeping at the loss of his friend, was processed through the field hospital. It was a cold, unheated room where stretchers lined the floor. He witnessed the severe trauma of men thrashing and screaming, reliving their battles in sleep. His extended combat experience, nearly 8 months of constant K-rations, had left him with lasting digestive issues. It was a physical reminder of the war's toll. After surgical attention and a period of rehabilitation, he prepared for a return to duty. He found himself in the bureaucratic morass of the peacetime army. Though promotions were arbitrarily cancelled, the narrator asserted his desire for command. He returned to the regiment and demanded his rightful place. The end of the European war arrived quietly. VE Day, May 8, 1945, signalled a transition into the strange, uncertain world of military occupation. The narrator reached Bamberg 2 days later. He viewed the ruins of Nuremberg, the futility of the Maginot Line, and the dejected German soldiers straggling home. This was a stark contrast to the memory of Hitler's rabid disciples. The war was over in Europe, but the profound physical and psychological scars of the infantry soldier, the true price of the conflict, would endure long after the guns fell silent. The transition from the shell-shocked intensity of combat to the quietude of peacetime occupation was jarring, almost surreal. The author's duty station in Dinkelsbühl offered an idyllic, if temporary, respite from the horrors of the past year. The days were filled with pleasantly mundane recreation. They enjoyed the competitive thwack of horseshoes and the quiet focus of fishing. The local streams yielded almost 100 nice 10 to 15-inch trout. This bounty felt impossibly removed from the starvation diet of K-rations. They observed a German farmer harvesting hay by hand, using cradle scythes and wooden-tined rakes. A draft horse and a milk cow were hitched side by side to pull the wagon. It felt like stepping back a century, underscoring the stark cultural divide obscured by the chaos of war. This period of quiet reflection was the calm before the final move home. In June 1945, after 15 months overseas, 5 major campaigns and 3 years of service, the author boarded the USAT Excelsior on July 3rd. They carried the weight of 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars and 1 Silver Star. The voyage home across the Atlantic was a final, uncomfortable ordeal. The troopship pitched and rolled severely in the high seas. Its stern lifted until the propeller vibrated violently out of the water. Below deck, many men succumbed to seasickness. They were unable to find comfort or distraction. The emotional climax of the author's long service arrived not on a battlefield, but through a news bulletin. The dropping of the atomic bomb and Japan's subsequent surrender on September 2, 1945, brought an overwhelming wave of relief. The news confirmed what the soldiers had desperately hoped for. The planned bloody invasion of Japan was cancelled. Tears of joy were shed in the camps and on the ships. This was a visceral acknowledgement that countless lives, including their own, had been spared the final, terrible cost of war. The author arrived home in Grand Ledge, Michigan, at 2 o'clock in the morning on July 16th. The delicious feeling of being home again was immediate. The arrival itself was anticlimactic. No one was there to meet him in the quiet, early morning darkness. Just 5 days later, he married his bride-to-be, Florine, in a church ceremony and reception, as marked the official, joyful return to his personal life. Yet the physical and psychological toll of the war was an unwelcome, enduring passenger. The almost continuous 8-month diet of K-rations had inflicted lasting digestive issues. It was a persistent physical scar. The memories, however, were deeper. The return to the bureaucracy of the peacetime army felt absurdly distant from the life-and-death stakes he had just endured, that witnessed half-hearted training, relaxed discipline, and men marching out with extra bulges in their shirts. The final act of separation from the military was defined by tedious paperwork. The absurdity of the process was crystallized in the requirement to declare every non-military item for customs. This bureaucratic ritual seemed laughably trivial given the profound, unquantifiable nature of the experience he was leaving behind. On September 30th, 1945, after 3 years and 11 days in the U.S. Army, the author became a full-time civilian. His choice of post-war career was laced with dark irony. He went into sales, specifically selling insurance. This profession attempts to put a price on a loss. This contrasted starkly with his profound wartime experience of death and destruction that carried with it no compensation whatsoever. The war had fundamentally altered his perspective. It led to a single, unshakable philosophical conclusion: the overwhelming firepower he had witnessed, and the terrifying finality of the nuclear weapons that ended the conflict, solidified his belief. War, in the modern age, is never a victory. The cost in grief and devastation is so immeasurably expensive that the concept of winning is rendered meaningless. The author concluded that the only viable path forward was one of absolute prevention. He advocated for a global posture of maintaining strength overwhelming enough that no one would dare take the first step toward war. The true price of conflict was not counted in territory or medals. It was counted in the enduring change war inflicts on the individual soul. This change demands that peace be paramount at all costs.